With advances to modern consoles, it was only a matter of time before analog sticks became standard on any console. Our thoughts were, was it possible to add an analog stick to a classic console like a Game Boy Color? Well, yes, of course it is. But before you jump the gun, let's show you the process of how to install one into your console. With any mod, first comes the planning. Where would it fit? The first place that came to mind was the bottom left-hand corner above the power regulator. We then did some thorough research to find if there was already an existing product that would fit inside a Game Boy shell. However, we fell short, so we turned our attention to AliExpress. We found this prefabricated circuit on AliExpress for less than $1 that measures 2 cm by 2 cm by 5 mm thick. Next, we focused our attention on the wiring. The solder points are quite fine and do need some soldering skills. We used @NatalieTheNerd's diagram as a point of reference for soldering points. You have two options for power, either the right far pin on the cartridge slot or marked VCC near the power switch. Ground can come off the left-hand pin of the cartridge slot. As the soldering points are very fine, approximately 1 mm, we first recommend prepping the surface before soldering. This involves preparing the thin gauge wire, we use 36 AWG in this case, and prepping the solder points with flux. We then turned our attention to the analog controller and soldered a black wire for ground and a red wire for voltage. Then, using Natalie the Nerd's diagram, we soldered the points from the Game Boy Color PCB to the analog controller. The finished product should look something like this. The next step is to insulate the PCB to avoid shortages. In this case, we added some resettable fuses just in case, and changed the capacitors while we're at it. The next step in the process, and the most dreaded, is testing. We mocked up the Game Boy shell and had everything laid out loosely, then powered it up and tested it with Tetris. To our delight, everything worked smoothly. Next part was to mount it on the front of the Game Boy Color shell. This involves marking out the location on the front of the Game Boy shell, and we found that 9 mm was the ideal hole size. Once installed, we ensured that the fitment and feel was correct before turning our attention to organising the wiring. We then finished off the soldering for the Q5 IPS screen and then tidied up the cabling with some caftan tape. We also ensured that the back of the analog controller was insulated with some electrical tape so it wouldn't short on the power regulator. It was now time for a final tidy up, mounting the LCD, installing the buttons and rubbers, and closing the shell. We then sealed up the shell and focused our attention on creating a thumbstick, as the PCB does not contain a generic thumb. In this instance, you have several options, either creating a 3D printed thumb, or we used a pre-existing PlayStation 2 thumb, trimmed it down, drilled out a new hole, and mounted it to the existing analog stick. Well, here it is in all its glory, the Game Boy Color with the analog controller. We're extremely pleased on how this project came out and the overall finishes. The mod wasn't too difficult overall, bar the fine soldering points on the Game Boy Color motherboard. However, we've added a modern flair to a classic console. Now all that's left to do is to test it out and see how it functions. The PS2 thumbstick that we used gives recollections of a nostalgic past. The analog stick has a nice firm feel as it functions off tactile buttons and gives an immediate response. This is definitely a mod that we will consider installing into other consoles like the DMG Game Boy. We've hoped that this has inspired you to give this a go on your Game Boy Color console. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our other videos. Take care.